Yes, you're very welcome to a special edition of offtheball.com output. It's a breaking news edition because this is the morning that Arsene Wenger has brought an end to the era of Wenger at the Emirates Stadium. As of the end of this season, Arsene Wenger will no longer be Arsenal manager, having taken over in September 1996. So we thought we need to go live, we need to speak to the nation on what is one of the biggest sports stories that we're going to hear this weekend. So we brought in the heavy hitters to cover it. We're going to hear from Stewart Robson, former Arsenal midfielder, in a few minutes' time. But even in his shadow, it's Adrian Barry and Phil Egan.
All right, Dave.
Morning.
Offtheball.com output was a pretty catchy name for this item.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what we should brand it as.
Yeah, I could tell that.
You know, it's not OTB AM. It's not off the ball in the evening. It's not anything pre-recorded. We are live.
We're live. I'm interested to hear what people have to say about this. Like, it's sort of tracking a bit of the reaction on Twitter so far to the news that Arsene Wenger is now gone. And there's it's tinted with a fair bit of glee. I think it's fair enough to say, like, people are kind of pretty reacting with a lot of joviality to this. It's not it hasn't yet sort of the impact of the Wenger legacy isn't the main theme of the reaction so far. I'm interested to know what people think about it.
Yeah, well, I think if he had stepped down or announced that he's stepping down in 2006 after they've just been beaten by Barcelona in the Champions League final, straight away you're thinking his legacy, there's absolutely no joviality. There's despair that one of the greatest managers ever to grace the English game is gone. But I think, Phil, this was inevitable, and it's probably relief if you're an Arsenal fan, and a sense of I told you so if you're supporting anybody other than Arsenal.
Yeah, and you mentioned the 2006 Champions League final. Pretty much since that final, it's all kind of gone downhill.
Yeah.
Like, obviously Wenger's been there 22 years and his legacy will be split in two. The first half, incredible, unbelievable. 3 Premier League titles, 2 League and Cup doubles, obviously the invincible season. But then what we will remember, but what I hope is that people will start to remember in the next few weeks how good he was, not just recently how bad it was, where, you know, they got thumped in the Champions League. I can even remember the first day of the season in 2013, they lost 3-1 to Aston Villa at the Emirates. And the abuse he got. It
was toxic even then that day at the Emirates.
That was the thing. They were always one result away from that toxic nature at the Emirates.
Where the price is setting in.
Yeah, whereas now they just kind of resigned to it. And that was when he agreed last summer to sign a 2-year contract. I think it was very clever because I had a feeling he'd go after a year. But if he had signed a 1-year contract, then people would have said, so are you going to go? There wasn't as many questions this season, but there was a sense that he will go. And it's been a disaster, their league campaign. Hopefully the players can rally now and send them off on a high and win the Europa League.
Do you think the lack of questions about his future over the last couple of months, Adrian, has stemmed from the here we are again scenario? We're in this situation heading into the final 2 months of the season. That same situation we've been in for probably each of the last 5 seasons, bar maybe the season where they lost the league title to Leicester, where they were still in with a shed of the title going into the final 5 games. But journalists in general are just like, is there any point in asking this guy if he's going to be around next
season? Kicking a dog when he's down almost.
Exactly, they just couldn't be bothered anymore.
It does beg the question why he's leaving now. I mean, that might seem like the most ridiculous question that has ever been asked in the context of everything that we're talking about, but at the same time, like, this is a guy who, and I have to say that I would have been very much, I think I outlasted, not being particularly an Arsenal fan, and by the way, if I was to follow a club, it really should be Arsenal, but I've stuck with him for a long time, I have to say, because I admired not been invested in the results of Arsenal. I couldn't give a shite one way or the other. Not being particularly invested in the results, I really admired his approach to running a football club, and that's what he was doing. He's one of the last people involved in football at that level who is actually doing the Ferguson thing of, to a large degree, running the club, deciding on transfers, deciding on the general direction of the club. Obviously oversaw the significant move that they made away from Highbury, but I do wonder what's changed with him that he's now decided he's out, because not a lot has changed outside of that necessarily. I mean, they may miss out to Burnley obviously this season. Maybe there's factors like that are starting to feed into him, but I wonder what's changed in his mind that he's decided now.
Empty seats, a lot of empty seats.
Well, is there a commercial influence? Is there finally an influence at board level that is now taking its toll with Arsene Wenger? Has he been told to go?
Yeah, and they've also brought in obviously a director of football and a chief scout, so they've certainly got the blocks put in place for when he goes. And
he's no longer making those decisions,
No.
and I wonder, has that been an influence in his thought as well?
He's lost his power at the club, but surely when he looks around and he sees empty seats, he must kind of think, one thing we've had since we've moved into this new stadium is a full house. We've played football the right way, very entertaining, but people are now voting with their feet.
Yeah, it is. This season is as bad as it's ever been, though, isn't it? In terms of how poor they've played. I think they're the only team in the Premier League yet to pick up a point on the road in 2018, which is an astonishing statistic.
Jeez, I didn't know that. That's chronic.
They could easily finish 7th in the league. They haven't even been in the Champions League. The last Champions League memory, and this is quite a sad thing as well, that Arsenal fans will take from Wenger, is that 10-2 hammering at the hands of Bayern Munich. And this is a side that reached 2 European finals in 6 years. The UEFA Cup final in 2000 and then the Champions League final 6 years later. Lost both, but both very narrowly. And the last Champions League picture they will have in their minds of going down 10-2 to Bayern.
Yeah, and it's just unfortunate that the way it's worked out, they've been beaten badly. They make the same mistakes week in, week out. Okay, they had problems with goalkeeper for a while. They brought in Petr Cech. Unfortunately, he's now coming to the end. His ability is certainly nowhere near what it was when he was number one at Chelsea. They make defensive errors. There's no protection there. You just look at them and you think, like Steve Bold, who was such a legendary defender at the club, and you think, if he is part of the coaching staff, how are they making these mistakes? And the word is that Wenger just has all the control, and he won't criticise his players. So whoever comes in, they're going to have to go for somebody that just cracks skulls and is the boss. But that might upset the players then.
Did he bring pasta to the Premier League? Wasn't this whole thing when he came in? It's like English football doesn't know how to treat itself in terms of its behaviour towards the game, that it's the Arsenal Tuesday club or whatever it was.
He certainly was influential in dropping the drinking culture and the smoking culture, indeed, that was.
And the dietary requirements.
Yeah, no ketchup.
I'm trying to think of influential Italians that would have been in around the Premier League before he arrived. So certainly Vialli was at
in terms
Chelsea.
of the pasta specifically.
Yeah, whether he specifically
I was using that as a catch-all term
in.
for nutrition, Dave, I won't lie to you. There was one quote that sort of jumped out for me, like in terms of because I think it's right to, at this juncture, pay a bit of sort of deference to the guy and the job that he's done. I think that's what people have been waiting for him to actually step down, so they could, the Arsenal Fan TV people could actually take a step back and go, okay, he's done his club some service. But one quote that sort of stood out for me from the statement that he's released today, that it's going to break your heart a little bit when you hear this. To all the Arsenal lovers, take care of the values of the club. My love and support forever. I'm getting emotional even reading that. Like, it's a guy that's his life's work.
It is his life's work, but everything has to end at some stage. The Ferguson era had to end, and the Cody era will end someday, and that's just the way things are. It's. I
don't think I feel the same. I feel a bit emotional about Wenger, because I think that he obviously stayed a bit beyond where he probably should have been, and he's actually, I believe, just a likeable person, whereas that doesn't necessarily apply with a lot of the examples that you've mentioned. You know what I mean? Like, that there's a bit of, you've been there, you've done that. Ferguson got out at a slightly different time, obviously, and
on top, yeah,
people sort of feel as if was for slightly different, more cynical reasons, perhaps, in the age profile and general state of the team when he left. Although you could definitely apply that with this Arsenal team.
We'll talk to Stewart Robson about the legacy that he leaves and whether or not he's just about got out on time to save some of that, because it's been so bad for the last few seasons. But obviously another part of the discussion is going to revolve around his successor. So the names I've already seen being bandied about, apart from Alan Pardew, obviously, who's going to be front and centre in his own mind.
And Joey Barton, who's been touted as well, I see. I mean, maybe it might come a bit too early for Joey, is the only thing.
There's four really that are kind of at the forefront of my mind, one of which is Diego Simeone, who says he's not leaving Atletico Madrid at the end of the season, but he may well be persuaded to go.
Maybe Atletico will beat them so badly in the Europa League he'll feel sorry for Arsenal and he'll think, you know what, this club needs me.
Or maybe Arsenal knocked them out and he thinks this club has potential and now's the perfect time to take them over. They're going to be back in the Champions League. He may well be saying to himself, I'm not going to Arsenal unless they're in the Champions League. So that'll be an interesting one. Unai Emery, who we know is going to be leaving, almost certainly going to be leaving PSG at the end of the season, and Massimiliano Allegri, unless he fancies sticking with a Juventus side that's clearly on the wane. So it's a difficult one. There's a couple of comments coming in. A year or two late, but the right call. Now get someone like Simeone in and get the players and organise with a plan for each match, says Jim McCarthy. Rowan says post 2006 wasn't a failure, nowhere near the financial power of others in the league.
they probably had the power. They just the main criticism was they just weren't spending. He wasn't.
Well,
spending.
certainly for a while, because they moved into the new stadium in 2006.
Hampered, yeah.
Certainly for a while they didn't have the capacity to deal with the likes of Manchester United and Chelsea at the time, particularly after Abramovich arrived at Chelsea. But I don't think you could say that for the last 3 or 4 years. There's definitely been the financial clout, maybe not to compete, pound for pound with the likes of City and Manchester United, but certainly with the likes of Tottenham and Chelsea, Liverpool.
And the other side of it was that people always spoke about, the players that he had, and was he actually getting the best out of them. When we looked to the likes of Theo Walcott, who would have left the club, and Eddie Ox, obviously, more recently, who is turning into a fine player who we are starting to see the best of. And it's probably things more like that you start to look at and think, actually, maybe he is just a little bit
Throw Jack Wilshere in there. Aaron Ramsey, has he improved to the point where we thought he might do? So a lot of your comments coming in, keep them coming in on all of our all of our social media mediums. You can get us on Twitter at Off The Ball. Stewart Robson, former Arsenal midfielder, and a man we've had talking about Wenger on Off The Ball many times in the recent past, is on the line. Stewart, thanks for taking the call.
No problem at all.
You probably knew that as soon as you heard the news that Wenger was stepping down at the end of the season, that you would see the Off The Ball number on your phone pretty soon afterwards. What's your overriding emotion now, having heard the news?
I don't think there is any emotion from me. I've been fed up with Arsene Wenger's managerial reign for the last probably 7 or 8 years. So I'm pleased. I think it's the best thing that can happen to Arsenal. I'm looking at it very straightforward. I think it's the best thing for Arsenal. I think the next manager will struggle because he's left the club in quite a state in terms of the mentality, the philosophy, and the amount of players that are at the club that aren't quite good enough. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the next manager. And when Arsene Wenger says he loves the club and he's done everything he possibly can to make the club better, I would disagree. I think in recent times he's almost gone away from that and made it more difficult for the next manager coming in. So my view is the next manager will struggle, but I think it's great for Arsenal Football Club that Arsene Wenger has now decided to leave.
But when he says that he's done everything in his power, Stuart, to try and move the club on, that's certainly something he would believe in his own mind. You just disagree with it, obviously, but I'm sure Arsene Wenger believes that.
Yes, I think he's tried to move himself on. That's I would say I get very agitated when I hear about him saying he loves the club and he's tried to do everything. If he wanted to push the club forward, he'd have allowed some of the things that have been taking place recently to have happened earlier, and because it's been taken away from him, the recruitment, the sports science, all these things that have gone wrong at Arsenal over the last few years. The development of young players has all gone wrong over the last few years, and instead of embracing help, he's actually shied away from it and said, no, I know best. And I think he's been rather selfish in that way.
How will history look upon Wenger now, Stuart? Has it gone on so long in the last maybe 4 or 5 seasons that the balance between his legacy remaining intact and history looking upon him fondly has now been lost with what's gone on over the last few seasons, and now actually that is the overriding memory that an awful lot of Arsenal fans will have of him? And if that is the case, that's such a pity.
Well, obviously, he had a magnificent first few seasons. I was watching from afar then because I was working at other clubs and I was looking at players at a lower level. And then when I started to become a pundit and started to analyse Arsenal at 2006, 2007, when they were the last season at Highbury, I started to question what I was seeing. I was starting to question all the interviews that I was hearing. Arsene Wenger contradicted himself about tactics, contradicting himself about how players should be developed. All these sort of things I started to question. And then when I saw Arsenal lose games, I saw them lose games in the same way, time and time again. So it didn't look as though he had learnt the game. So in my view, I think what he did very well in the early days is he recruited well. He knew the French market when bringing in Henry and Vieira and players like that. Bergkamp was already there. He had a back four that was already being designed by George Graham, and George Graham did that brilliantly. So I think, and he went into an environment where he changed the environment, where it wasn't all about scrapping and fighting and shouting at each other. He wanted to calm everything down. He went into the nutritional side of things. So he was a really good person to come in at that time. When it started to go wrong, I just can't see he didn't have the tactical nous to then change it, and that's been my opinion for the last, I would say, last 10 years, and I wrote articles about it 8 years ago, so I'm not surprised that things haven't gone particularly well over the last 8 years.
Hi Stuart, I think it's very harsh listening to you there to say that to question his love for the club. I mean, I think all those things could actually coexist, that love isn't frequently a very linear thing, that actually he can be totally in love with the club and still be making some of the wrong calls. But I am interested to sort of get, I know you're limited on time, and I'm interested to get your take on who you think is going to be, I suppose there might be a difference between the right person and who's going to actually get the job, but your thoughts on both of those things.
If I was on the board, I'd be looking at Antonio Conte straight away. He's going to leave Chelsea. I think there's no question about that. I think he's won the title for Juventus 3 out of 3 years. He's won it once last year with Chelsea. I thought he did a fantastic job with Italy when he had some very poor players, as it's been proved now. Italy not qualifying for the World Cup. I would go for Antonio Conte. That would be a brave move by the board, but probably one they won't take. They'll probably go with Joachim Löw or somebody like that.
Just finally, Stuart, what kind of effect do you think it will have on the players for the rest of the season? Will it spur them on maybe to win a Europa League?
I think some will be pleased, some will be disappointed. They've got every chance of winning Europa League. They've got a big tie against Atletico Madrid. If they can win that, they'll win. I think they'll win. So you don't know how the Arsenal players are going to respond, because over the last few years we've seen some great displays and we've seen some horrendous displays. And which way is it going to go? We don't know yet.
Stuart, thanks so much for making the time for us this morning.
Cheers.
Absolute pleasure.
Stewart Robson, former Arsenal midfielder, giving us his thoughts on the breaking news this morning that Arsene Wenger will be stepping down as Arsenal manager at the end of the season. Plenty of people getting in touch, including our own fearless leader, Jerry Gilroy on Twitter. The Arsenal job is now one of the best in world football. No comparison to United after Fergie. Arsenal are a giant dozing after a big lunch in the mid-afternoon after a glass too many of Chablis. There is no question this is one of the most attractive jobs in European football, particularly so if they do manage to get beyond Atletico Madrid and beat out Marseille or Salzburg in the Europa League final. I know there are two big ifs there, but a manager potentially taking over a Champions League club of that financial clout with that stadium in London, and some of the players in the squad, Stewart Robson obviously feels are a number that need to be ditched, but there's the basis of a good team. It's as good a job as you'll find anywhere.
The problem is, if they don't get Champions League, some of those managers that we mentioned won't be interested. You mentioned Allegri. He wants to manage in the Champions League.
But will they not be willing to, suck it up for
Sit
1
it out
year?
for a year, yeah.
Given the wages they're likely to earn, I would
Yeah.
imagine that Allegri can at the very least double the money he's on in Turin at the moment.
I think what we've seen in the Premier League in the past is that clubs that are not in the Champions League, but they're out of Europe altogether. Look at Conte and Chelsea, Leicester. They won the league because they just have one focus. But Arsenal are going to have the Europa League regardless next season, if they don't have Champions League, which, okay, they've managed it quite well this season because they've changed teams around, but they want to be playing in the Champions League, these top managers. Like the way they work, some of them, it's the intensity and the pressure on modern day managers now is they don't have time to say, right, I'll spend a season and we'll play in the Europa League, we'll try and get them back into it. They want to be in the Champions League at the biggest clubs and get the job done and get out in about 3 seasons.
The other reason that I think it's a pretty attractive gig is that it's the expectation level has been set so low now that no matter what you do when you come in there, that it's only going to really be a step forward. But I mean, I do think it's a huge job at hand in terms of trying to. It actually, funny enough, it came up in the Keith Andrews show yesterday with Keith, just as a sort of, we were talking about Sean Dyche actually, and I was kind of
there.
recommending that he would. I thought that Sean Dyche would be a good fit for Arsenal. Now that Wenger's gone, I'm not 100% sure I believe that, but there's a cultural job to be done there to try and lift those players out of that kind of slumber.
What Stewart Robson was referring to there. Patrick Vieira will be favoured to take on the role, ? He was actually mentioned yesterday by Arsene Wenger in his press conference as a person that he felt could be a possibility and would be able to do the job. Rowan says get Arteta in. That would be a move from left field to get the Man City assistant manager in, a guy who's done
a bit too early for him.
Nothing at senior level as a top flight manager. Ali Mazyun, wow, I'm actually heartbroken. I wonder, is that person an Arsenal fan? And if so, surely the feeling is a little more of relief that you've actually got rid of the manager that's been dragging you down for the last 7
I'd say
or 8
there's
years.
still a cohort of Arsenal fans out there who they're obviously the silent Brexiteers who you're not going to hear from, who I'm not saying they're perfectly happy with Wenger being there, but we're giving him enough rope on Phil's point about what he'd achieved earlier in the season in his career, that, I'm not saying that they were delighted he was still there or that there was any progression happening at the club, but that they were willing to suck it up given what he delivered for them.
Well, we shall see if they can get beyond Atletico Madrid and potentially leave as Arsene Wenger with a manager with
Does he, by the way, it's worth it, I don't know, has Wenger given any indication if he's going to continue in the game?
He hasn't today, no. It's just a statement. I'm sure they're the kind of question he'll have to answer in his next press conference.
PSG, maybe.
Is he definitely leaving the club completely?
Yeah.
It does. The statement does say leaving the club at the end of the season, but there was also talk that he might end up going upstairs in some sort of a director of football capacity. I'd say that's a bit unlikely. We shall see. You just saw the graphic a moment ago. It just so happens that our next Premier League game, live and off the ball, involves Arsenal, and it'll be Gary Breen that'll be alongside Nathan. Gary is a boyhood Arsenal fan, so no doubt he will have plenty to say on the news that's been breaking this morning that Arsene Wenger is leaving Arsenal at the end of the season after 22 years in charge. That's live on Sundays off the ball. Nathan and Gary from 1:30 at the Emirates Stadium. Phil Egan and Adrian Barry, thanks for stepping into the break at such short notice.
Pleasure.
Breaking news is breaking news.
Yeah,
it had to be covered.
What's the live game on Premier League Live?
We've got two. We've got West Brom, Liverpool. Liverpool might rest players for the Champions League, but it'll be interesting to see if Salah plays. And then we have Watford and Crystal Palace. And our boot room interview this week is Mark Lawrenson on the '84 European Cup final, which so happened to be between Liverpool and Roma.
There you go. Wonderful symmetry there. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll chat to you again soon. Off the Ball is live from 7 o'clock this evening.